Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Philip Lipsey, and I direct the Center for the Study of Global Japan at the University of Toronto. Before we begin, I would like to deliver a land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I would also like to thank Mio Otsuka, our events program coordinator, as well as the staff of the Monk School for their support, and our co-sponsors of the event, the Consul General of Japan in Toronto and the Toronto Star. Following the presentations, we will have a Q&A session. Please use the built-in Q&A feature on Zoom or email csgj.monk@utoronto.ca to submit your questions. Due to the memorial nature of today's event, we have asked our IT staff to allow audience members to appear on screen to ask their questions by request. If you would like to deliver your question in this manner, please indicate in person when you submit your question, and please turn on your camera and microphone when our staff upgrades you to a panelist. If you do not indicate in person, we will direct your question to the moderator to pose to the panelists. So turning to today's event honors the memory of our dear friend, Okamoto Yukio. I first met Yukio over a decade ago when I was just starting out as an assistant professor. He was already a legendary figure, a distinguished diplomat and advisor to successive prime ministers. I was honored in 2014 to present alongside him on a panel about Japanese politics under Abe at Stanford University. What really struck me about Yukio was not his long resume or his sharp intellect, though both of these were clearly very formidable, but his warmth and generosity in engaging with scholars like myself who were just getting started. Yukio was a bridge builder between Japan and the United States throughout his career, but he was also a keen advocate for stronger relations between Canada and Japan. He became a core supporter of establishing a hub for the study of Japanese politics and diplomacy here at the University of Toronto in order to strengthen ties between the two nations. His wise advice and counsel was critical in the establishment of the Center for the Study of Global Japan, which I now direct. My colleague Lou Polly and I had met with Yukio in Tokyo last October to discuss new avenues for collaboration and cooperation. And Yukio was sharp and witty, as always. He warmly accepted our invitation to visit in the near future to share his thoughts with us here in Toronto. We were thus shocked to learn that he tragically passed away in April due to complications arising from COVID-19. He is greatly missed by all of us. We have received several messages from colleagues in Japan who are close to Yukio. Former Japanese ambassador to the United States, Sasai Kenichiro, conveys his regrets that he cannot attend the event today, but he writes, quote, "Yukio is a truly lovable great hero of the day," end quote. Miyake Kunihiko, president of the Foreign Policy Institute, writes, quote, "Yukio Okamoto, my big brother, mentor, and role model, passed away on April 24th. Okamoto was always interested in making and implementing policies. He was a man of ideas, actions, and persuasions. He was confident that his methodology was the real orthodoxy. He must have been mulling over the global state of affairs in a post-COVID-19 era. We have many questions, but unfortunately, his life was too short. May his soul rest in peace," end quote. Today, we have assembled a panel of truly distinguished experts to honor Yukio's legacy and discuss future directions in Japanese foreign policy. Our panelists knew Yukio well, and Professor Tadokoro was part of the Japan Now seminar series at the University of Toronto in 2016 that also featured Yukio. Ambassador Deanna Horton, a senior fellow at our center, and herself a distinguished Canadian Foreign Service officer who spent 12 years in Tokyo, will introduce the panel and moderate. Before we begin, I would like to ask Consul General Sasayama Takuma to offer remarks. Despite arriving to his post in the middle of a worldwide pandemic, Consul General Sasayama has already left his mark in Toronto, actively engaging local stakeholders and generously making himself available to my students who are studying Japanese politics and foreign policy. We are deeply grateful to him for joining us today. Consul General Sasayama.
Very good morning, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Lipsy. Ms. Diana Horton, former ambassador of Canada and senior fellow, Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Dr. Michael Green, senior vice president for Asia and Japan chair, GSIS. Dr. Richard Samuels, Ford International Professor of Political Science and Director, Center for International Studies, MIT. Professor Tadokoro Masayuki, Professor of International Relations, Faculty of Law, Keio University, and of course, Dr. Philip Lipsy, the Director of Center for the Study of Global Japan Monk School. Distinguished guests, friends, and colleagues. Today's event is a bittersweet occasion when we honor a distinguished diplomats and respected leader in the international relations. Mr. Okamoto Yukio sadly passed away on April of this year because of COVID. In the shadow of this pandemic, those of us who work in diplomacy, as well as those who studied world affairs, feel the enormity of this loss. Mr. Okamoto was a good friend of the University of Toronto and the Monk School. He understood the importance of maintaining strong Japan-Canada relations. He also saw the advantage of establishing the Center for the Study of Global Japan here when he visited in 2016. I am certain he would have been extremely proud to see the center's current trajectory towards becoming one of the world's most renowned academic institutions focusing on Japan. Let me allow me to talk about my personal relations, experience with Okamoto-san. I joined Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs back in 1988. He was already well known and highly respected for his energetic and dynamic style of diplomacy. He carried many projects for their successful completion, starting with those dealing with Japan-US relations. Mr. Okamoto was someone who would work endlessly without sleep whenever such commitment was needed. It is said that with the outbreak of the Gulf War back in the 90s, there were mornings as a young diplomat when goes to the foreign affairs of Japan. Ministry staff arrived at work to see Mr. Okamoto at his desk already in the morning after having spent the night. In the morning, he was toweling his body in lieu of the bath or a shower. And we realized how a harsh workplace foreign affairs of Japan is. It's a moving memory. At the same time, he was a very kind man. For example, whenever young diplomats were assigned to training posts in the US, he made a point to have them meet the American ambassador in Tokyo before they left. He also loved the sea and was a passionate scuba diver known for his beautiful underwater photographs. Mr. Okamoto left our Ministry of Foreign Affairs after serving as the director of the first North America division. He remained tremendously active afterwards, traveling to the United States and elsewhere and exchanging opinions and information with some of the most influential people in the world. The world after COVID will be a very different place, with new challenges as well as unprecedented opportunities. Although Mr. Okamoto's knowledge and expertise will be sorely missed as we navigate these uncertain times, his legacy will endure in the scholarly activities that continues at the Center for the Study of Global Japan here in Toronto. I would like to extend my heartfelt congratulations to Dr. Lipsey for this successfully realizing today's event. I also would like to thank Mr. Horton, Dr. Green, Dr. Samuels, and Dr. Tadokoro for their participation. I look forward very much to your presentation. Lastly, I hope everyone in attendance will find the views expressed today informative and insightful. As if Mr. Okamoto is still here. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we'll pass things over to Ambassador Deanna Horton.
Thank you all. Sasayama Soryoji, arigatou gozaimashita. I'm honored to participate with this very distinguished panel. I'm going to give some very brief introductions. You will all have seen longer biographies in the notes. Starting with Professor Tadokoro from Keio University in Tokyo. Tadokoro Sensei is a political economist and an expert on Japanese foreign aid and security policy. Currently, he is working on the international politics of population movement across borders. Born in Osaka, he attended Kyoto University and the London School of Economics. Previously, he was a professor at the National Defense Academy. His publications are too numerous to mention. Most recently, his publications in English include such titles as Why Did Japan Fail to Become the Britain of Asia in the book, The Russo-Japanese War in Global Perspective. He also might be known to some of you as the co-editor of a University of Toronto press book, Japan as a Normal Country, A Nation in Search of Its Place in the World. He also wrote a chapter, Changed Discourses on Demography in Japan, in the book, Italy and Japan, How Similar Are They? Next, Mike Green. Mike, welcome back to the Mug School, even virtually. Mike is Senior Vice President for Asia and Japan Chair, Center for Strategic and International Studies, also Director of Asian Studies, Chair in Modern and Contemporary Japanese Politics and Foreign Policy at the School of Foreign Service, Georgetown University. Mike served on the staff of the National Security Council, the NSC, from 2001 through 2005. First as Director for Asian Affairs with responsibility for Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and then as Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and Senior Director for Asia with responsibility for East Asia and South Asia. Before joining the NSC staff, he was a Senior Fellow for East Asian Security at the Council of Foreign Relations, Director of the Edwin O. Reischauer Center and the Foreign Policy Institute, and Assistant Professor at the School of International Studies, ZEISS, at Johns Hopkins University. Research staff member at the Institute for Defense Analyses and Senior Advisor on Asia in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He also worked in Japan on the staff of a member of the National Diet. Finally, Richard Samuels, Ford International Professor of Political Science and Director, Center for International Studies, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In 2005, Professor Samuels was elected a member of the American Academy of Arts and Science, and in 2001, he received the Order of the Rising Sun, Gold and Silver Star, an imperial decoration awarded by the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese Prime Minister. In 2015, he was named an Albert Einstein Visiting Fellow at the Free University of Berlin. His books have won awards from the Association for Asian Studies, the American Political Science Association, the Society for Italian Historical Studies, and other organizations. He has published articles in International Security, International Organization, the Journal of Japanese Studies and Foreign Affairs, among other journals, and his most recent book, Special Duty, A History of the Japanese Intelligence Community, I really want to read that one, was named one of the best books 2019 by the Council on Foreign Affairs Relations Journal Foreign Affairs. Nikkei Books will soon publish its Japanese translation. Okamoto Yukio. I remember him from when he was director of Hokubeika, the first North American division at Gaimusho in the late 1980s. By Japanese bureaucrat standards, he was a strong personality. He then did what was at the time unthinkable for a rising star in the foreign ministry, to leave and become a consultant. I then encountered him again when I was back in Tokyo and working on G7 summits in Okinawa and at Kananaskis when Canada hosted. So when this panel came up, I contacted a couple of my former State Department colleagues. One comment was, Okamoto-san was unafraid to tell people what he thought, and that willingness to speak truth to power, as well as his deep knowledge of Japan's key relationships with North American partners, made him an influential player in the Japanese policy scene for decades. This was then followed by the comment, and he made a mean martini. So on that note, I'm going to start with Tadokoro Sensei. I will turn the mic over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Horton, for your kind introduction. And first of all, I want to register my deep regret for the loss of Yukio Okamoto. And you can't believe how much shocked I was when I first heard about his death. As everybody here probably knows, the number of the deaths out of this pandemic in Japan is relatively limited. And I was told later by my friends within MOPA that he was cheerfully talking into the mobile phone right the day before he passed away. And nobody had expected he would lose his life. Also, I was told that if he had been infected somewhat later stage of this pandemic, he would surely be saved because doctors had learned a great deal in curing how to handle this disease. So again, I want to register my deep sense of loss. For today's presentation, I just want to make three brief points. First is very closely related to his final job at MOPA, the Japanese post-Cold War foreign policy challenge. Secondly, I want to briefly talk about how far have we come in overcoming the challenges over the last 30 years since the first Gulf War in 1991. And then I am going to briefly touch upon what we could possibly expect under new American administrations. Hopefully it will materialize. And also new Prime Minister, Mr. Suga, and what is likely to happen under the two leaders of our country. Now, post-Cold War foreign policy challenge. As everybody here knows, 1991, well, perhaps everybody, not everybody, because it is already 30 years ago, and many of my students simply did not know what happened in 1991. The first Gulf War probably was the biggest foreign policy setback for Japanese post-war history. We simply did not know how to handle it. We are utterly unprepared for the new security environments and new expectations from the international community. And we talked and talked and talked, and the public were confused. Intellectual leaders were confused, and the political leaders could not take risks in making decisions. And Mr. Okamoto was on the front line of this Japanese foreign policy, handling as the director of the first division of the North American Bureau. he actually, I'm sure that it must be a very much traumatic experiences for him. And he never said so explicitly whenever I saw him. He never said so, even when I asked him, and he never said so in his later memoir. But I suspect that he quit the job of MOFA after 1991 Gulf War, largely because of his disappointment, his sense of burnout, and he sensed the limitation as a diplomat in handling public policy. Now, the nature of setback is deeply related to Japanese post-war foreign policy institutions, namely post-war Constitution, 1947 Constitution, as well as US-Japan security alliances. I want to go very much in detail on that. However, I want to remind you that even after he left MOFA, he came back to the government as an advisor to the Prime Minister, and he worked on two peculiarly difficult jobs. One is about Okinawa issue, and he got deeply involved in alleviating the pains suffered by the local communities hosting the American bases in Okinawa. It was not an easy job, and it must have been kind of the thorny political nettles nobody wants to grasp, but he did not shy away from the challenge. And then he came back again as an advisor to the Prime Minister in his personal capacity for Iraq issue after 2003 Second Gulf War. Japanese government this time reacted more quickly. Under Koizumi government, Japanese did make some improvement in taking some political risks and making tough decisions. But Okamoto-san was also on the front line of the operation of the post-conflict reconstruction. And he, as had been already mentioned earlier by many, he is not operating from headquarters in Tokyo. He went to Iraq many times, and he worked with his colleagues of MOFA, and perhaps it is a good pertinent for us to remember that two Japanese diplomats were killed during their activities in Iraq. So they are the casualties of the war. And also, if I may add something somewhat personal, two of my students at National Defense Academy were deployed in Iraq for the post-conflict support operations. So this time, Japanese took somewhat more risk for their larger public good. Still, I'm not sure how far we have come. So this leads to my second point. Over the last 30 years, how much further we have come in overcoming the kind of the challenges Mr. Okamoto have faced. Yes, we may have made many progresses. US-Japan security alliance has become much tighter. And we even, in a very modest way, so changed our official interpretation of the Constitution, which allows Japanese to cooperate somewhat more closely with American forces. But the two major Japanese foreign policy institutions are still there, largely intact. And Japanese have been still involved in highly legalistic public discussions constitutionality of this and that, rather than what kind of values we are going to defend, and what kind of risk we are going to take, and what kind of costs we are going to pay for the larger purposes. So we may have come some way, but jobs are still largely unfinished, I'm afraid to add. Finally, under the new leadership, do we have any chance for us to see dramatic change in our institutions, our foreign policy institutions? My quick answer is probably no. Mr. Suga is not a foreign policy prime minister. He is a self-made person, and he came from the rural part of Japan, worked hard, and 10 years older than Prime Minister Abe, who had clear foreign policy agenda. Mr. Suga was a very steady, very reliable chief cabinet secretary. Nevertheless, foreign policy agenda is not his primary concern. He will rely much upon the existing institutional setting. He may be good at operating under the existing institutional environments. Nevertheless, he does not have any strong appetite to overhaul the institutional environments. However, everything cannot be decided by his leadership, meaning things can be driven by events. If some crisis should happen, which cannot be ruled out, particularly when American leadership is relatively shaky, the adventurous activities by China over Senkaku, or perhaps more realistically over Taiwan, South China Sea, and Japanese may be forced to make very tough decisions. I hope that we can make decisive decisions and sound political leadership with informed public opinion. However, it is still a big challenge. And finally, I have to add that over the last 4 years, Japanese have managed relatively well in handling relationship with rather unusual American president. This is a diplomatic understatement. And Prime Minister Abe did a good job to court favor of President Trump. And the relationship between Japan and the United States probably is much better than United States. The relationship between the United States and its NATO allies, or even with Canada. However, you have to keep in your mind that the credibility of alliance was somewhat seriously questioned by many Japanese people, which may not be a completely bad thing. Japanese have taken for granted that Americans are always there. It shouldn't be taken for granted. Americans are not there to be nice to the Japanese. They are there to defend their national interest. So if we do not act in accordance with their national interests, they may dump us. And it is good for us to remember the possibility of that event. Nevertheless, the damage to the security, the credibility of the alliance should be seriously taken by American experts as well. I suspect that partly one of the reasons why Japanese government is taking relatively benign attitude or conciliatory attitude towards the government in Beijing recently is related to the Japanese relative loss of confidence in the security coverage by the United States, and they started, they never say so explicitly, in the fear of causing unfortunate self-fulfilling effects. Nevertheless, Japanese are sensing stronger need for hedging against betrayal by our ultimate security guarantor. I think I'll stop here, but again, I must register my strong sense of loss, and Mr. Okamoto betrays, as has been already mentioned, betrays the caricature, the stereotypical image about Japanese career diplomats. He didn't mince the words, and whenever I sat with him in many meetings, he spoke very critically, sharply, and sometimes against the incumbent government, and even to me. And in this spirit, I hope that we can continue better public dialogue, both here and in the United States, and between we and our friends in North America, Americans, and Canadians. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
田所先生、どうもありがとうございました。Thank you very much for your insight, and a reminder to our listeners to send us questions. We'd love to answer them. And now I'm going to turn it over to Mike Green.
Thank you very much, Gianna, and congratulations, Philip, on joining the Monk School. I had a terrific visit there as a guest of Gianna and the faculty, and I'm jealous, Philip. You have a great scholarly environment. I really appreciate that you have organized this for our friend Okamoto-san. You know, as a scholar, it reminds us that people make foreign policy, people make alliances. And yes, the US-Japan alliance is probably stronger than it has ever been. And structural realists will say it's in personal factors like the rise of China. But all of us who know Yukio and who know the history of Japanese foreign policy and the alliance know that alliances don't just happen. They are made and often saved by courageous officials like Yukio. And I would say he's in the small handful of officials who have been most influential in turning the alliance into what it is today. So I've met Yukio for the first time some decades ago, and I thought I would describe 4 brief vignettes, interactions I had with Yukio over the years, which I think tell you a lot about Yukio, but also the impact and legacy he has had. I first met Yukio in 1987. I was a student at Tokyo University, and I was working for a member of the LDP in the Diet named Shina Moto, who was a leader within the party and the Diet on foreign affairs, national security, and especially relations with the United States. And I got a job working for him while I was a student, because as you know, in Japanese universities, unlike University of Toronto, MIT, or Georgetown, the hard part is getting in. And then when you get in, you have a lot more free time than you think. So I got a job working for Shina Sensei, who knew my advisor at university back home. And this was a time in the late 1980s when the US and Japan were embarking on an entirely new level of defense cooperation, largely unknown to the public. The Soviet Union was expanding militarily in the Sea of Okhotsk on the Northern Territories, was sending submarines to Hawaii and San Diego with impunity. And the Reagan administration, to push back, convinced Prime Minister Nakasone of Japan that Japan should, within its constitution, build up the archipelago like a chain link fence to keep the Soviets back. And the US would build up its air and naval power as a spear to strike the Soviets in the event of a war. So it's very, very heady Cold War stuff. And Okamoto-san, as the head of the First North American Affairs Division, was frankly one of the few officials who knew the whole story. But at the same time that the security relationship was becoming the tightest it had been, the economic relationship was the worst it had ever been. As Dick Samuels will remember well, there were huge fights over techno-nationalism, FSX, the new fighter Japan was developing. In a 1988 survey, right around that time, I think it was Gallup who did the survey, more Americans said they were afraid of Japan than the Soviet Union. That's how bad the economic relationship had become. And Yukio was in the hot seat as the director of First North American Affairs Division. For him, Canada was the easy part. But the US, that was very, very tough. So that's the context in which I first met Yukio. I was asked by my boss in the Diet to carry papers to the foreign ministry. Kaban mochi, a bag carrier, a staffer, because my boss, Mr. Shina, was about to go to California the next day for an offsite with 5 members of US Congress to think through the relationship. So I show up in the foreign ministry and I go to the North American Affairs Bureau and the First Division. And of course, if you've been to a Japanese government office, everyone is packed into one big room. It's sort of like a newsroom in the US. And no one's there except Okamoto-san at 7:38 at night. And he was a god to me. I mean, he was a legend. And I gave him the papers, and then he asked me what I was researching and so forth. And then he told me, he said, "Don't worry, nobody's here because I sent them all home." So the other half of Sasayama's story is not only did officials come in the morning and he was there, he would send them home to their families at 7 or 8 at night and finish the work himself. He was beloved for things like that. The second brief anecdote or vignette came a decade later. I had finished working in the Pentagon, and I was at the Council on Foreign Relations as a fellow. But the Pentagon asked me if I could travel to Japan in my own capacity and do a thought piece for them on Futenma, on this Marine Corps air station that was so politically problematic in the relationship. So I spent a week in Okinawa, and then I went to Tokyo, and I got a meeting with Kajiyama Seiroku, who was the chief cabinet secretary, the position that Mr. Suga had for Mr. Abe. Very powerful behind the scene position. And I was, as Dick and Philip will appreciate, pretty excited as a fairly young scholar to be able to go and meet the chief cabinet secretary. So I went into his office, and there was Yukio, unexpected. And I had the very clear sense that Yukio was there to make sure I didn't cause trouble. Because he knew everything, that I was there to talk about Okinawa. And Kajiyama-san kind of got into the discussion, asked us to go to dinner with him, then asked us to go to Nijikai with him drinking. And as the night went on, Kajiyama-san slowly slipped under the table. And Yukio and I continued the discussion till about midnight, talking about Okinawa. And it was so obvious that Yukio was, first of all, fully trusted by the chief cabinet secretary, and not just Kajiyama, those before and after. In many ways, the most important person in the Japanese government dealing with Okinawa. It was so obvious that Yukio had his trust, but it was also obvious that Yukio had no benefit at all to himself for doing this. This is a really hard political problem. And Yukio spoke with passion because he felt an obligation as one of the managers of the US-Japan Alliance, a personal obligation to help relieve the burden on the people of Okinawa. And he never gave up on that. He went to the Pentagon repeatedly, urging consideration of the burden the Okinawan people take. Third vignette, a few years later, September 2001, after September 11th, I was in the White House working on the NSC staff. Everybody I worked for, Rich Armitage, Jim Kelly, Torkel Patterson, big names in the US-Japan Alliance on the American side, had been at more junior positions during the 1990-91 Gulf War, working with Yukio. They had been office directors, deputy assistant secretaries, directors. I was a director myself in 2001. And they had all told me after 9/11 how badly the US-Japan Alliance, and it wasn't just Japan's fault, but how badly the US-Japan Alliance had stumbled in the Gulf War. in part because the buildup of the Japanese island chain to contain the Soviets allowed Japan to play a, frankly, game-winning role at the end of the Cold War without taking on any new missions outside of the defense of Japan. And of course, the Gulf War was out of area. It was in a different place with a whole new set of political complications. And so, you know, the veterans of the Reagan administration all told me, we cannot make that mistake again. And they all listened to Yukio, who came to Washington, who met with Prime Minister Koizumi, with Chief Cabinet Secretary Fukuda, and in a very quiet way, was one of the key people in putting together the game plan for how Prime Minister Koizumi and President Bush would work the 9/11 and then Iraq contingencies, and not make the mistakes that President Bush's father had made in 1990, or President Kaifu and the Foreign Ministry had made in 1990 and 91. And one of the things Yukio said adamantly was no gaiatsu. Don't press Japan. Let me talk to Koizumi and Fukuda. Japan will make its own decision. And frankly, for those who had been through the Gulf War on the US side, that was absolutely critical to the credibility of the alliance going forward. And Prime Minister Koizumi announced significant assistance economically. Japan led in a conference on reconstruction for Afghanistan, sent the self-defense forces and diplomats, as we've heard, one of whom was a good friend of mine, were tragically lost in Iraq. And then, in a sweet irony that must have been particularly satisfying for Yukio, and then the Gaimusho, the foreign ministry, lobbied the Europeans and the Gulf states to do more to help. The gaiatsu, the foreign pressure, was now coming from Japan on other US partners and allies to do more. And I remember talking to Yukio about it, and if you knew Yukio, he always had this, sort of look of burden on him all the time. And then every once in a while, like sun rays coming through the clouds, this impish grin would come on his face. And he clearly relished this new role that Japan had. And then the fourth and last vignette came around 2000, trying to remember, 13 or 14, but it was before the anniversary of the end of World War II, when everyone in Japan and Asia and Washington knew that Prime Minister Abe would have to issue a statement. And Abe wanted it to be the penultimate statement on the end of the war and what it meant for Japan and the world, and Japan's reflection on what had happened. And so Yukio invited me and my wife. We were in Tokyo to dinner with his wife Kyoko at his apartment overlooking the water, of course, full of photographs of undersea diving expeditions he'd had. And then he asked me to go have a drink of whiskey with him. One of the other things about Yukio, and martinis, yes. Yukio's real talent was that he taught the Highlander bar in the Okura Hotel how to do stare, which is a Scottish word, an obscure Scottish word, which is a way of drinking the best single malt whiskey where you chill it almost to freezing point. I don't think whiskey can freeze, and then stir it exactly 300 times and drink it out of a martini beaker. And so I was looking forward to Yukio stirring, because he taught me this technique 300 times. And as he was stirring, he got very serious, and he said, you know, the anniversary statement is coming up, and on a personal level, I am going to research and write a book. He said, I already am, about what my father did in the war in China. And it was not good. And his family's experience in the war was not something they talked about, but he wanted to bring it out and explore it, because it was time. And it was, again, something that he did not have to do, but something that he thought, well, it was something he had not been asked to do. It was something he thought he had to do. And you know, the more perfect union, the U.S.-Japan alliance is always in search of a more perfect union. There's always mistrust. There's always uncertainty. And Yukio's brilliance was that he embraced the alliance with a passion, but all the warts and all the imperfections. And rather than avoiding working on those warts and imperfections and difficulties, he rushed to treat them and to address them, and often in the most personal way. And I would conclude by saying that the alliance today And Tadokoro Sensei accurately described some of the uncertainty, but the alliance today is exactly, I would say, the alliance, the more perfect alliance that Yukio of 1987 would have dreamt of. Support for the alliance is the highest it's ever been in polls in the US and Japan. We did a survey at CSIS on China policy. We asked how much risk the US should take to defend Japan. And in the US, thought leaders answered on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being significant risk. The mean was about 9. 9 on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest. Chicago Council of Global Affairs, other surveys that ask Americans about defending allies, Japan gets the highest marks, higher than NATO, and the highest in history. The Japanese foreign policy we see today, I would argue, is remarkable because it is a foreign policy that is upholding the neoliberal order, particularly in the Asia Pacific at a time when the US has, I'll be diplomatic, been on vacation for 4 years and has a lot at home to fix in the coming 4 years. But it's Japan that stood up with Canada and Australia to keep CPTPP going. It was Japan that pushed the Indo-Pacific concept and quality infrastructure. And institutionally, Yukio's legacy is strong. It was after he left the foreign ministry that they created the Soseikyoku, the Comprehensive Foreign Policy Bureau, for better crisis management, and the NSC under Abe. That was very much Yukio's vision of a more decisive and responsible Japan. So his legacy is enormous for Japan, for the US, for Canada, and I think for all of us on this panel, who in so many ways are, I think, better people and smarter about Japan because of Yukio. Thank you, Diana.
Thanks very much for your insight and reminiscences, which I think are very important in terms of outlining his role. Now I'd like to turn it over to Dick Samuels. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Diana, and thanks to my fellow panelists for 2 terrific presentations. I also have to thank, of course, our hosts here at the University of Toronto for organizing this tribute. Yukio was a very good friend of very long standing. And my wife, Deb, and I speak of him very often. And so I hope you'll indulge my my reminiscing for a moment or two as well. We first met at the Y Plantation in the late 1980s. I guess it was around the same time that Mike first met him. When at Y, MIT was organizing a conference, and he participated with his mentor, Watanabe Koji, on a panel on US-Japan relations, which is, as Mike described, is a very fractious moment. It was that era of so-called Nichibei Masatsu. And I recall how relaxed and how erudite and really how charismatic Yukio was. And we stayed in touch over the decades. He dropped in to see me at MIT, and I dropped in to see him at his office in Kamiyacho. Sometimes after a 1 or 2 year interval, but it never felt that much time had passed. And one such encounter really does stand out for me. It was a day late in the spring of 2011, while I was in Tokyo to do research on what became a book on the triple catastrophe in northeastern Japan, and I stopped by to do aisatsu. And he asked what I was working on. Same question he asked Mike when Mike was a student. When I told him 311, he brought me over to a large table in his conference room where there were several photo albums arrayed. And they were filled with his photographs of the Tohoku hellscape, but also included photographs of industrial equipment, very large shipping containers for shelter, compressors, and so forth, that he had convinced large Japanese firms on which he served as a board member to provide to help the local fishermen, fishing community get back up on its feet. And he didn't seek public acclaim for his efforts, but I know he took great pride privately, and deservedly so. A few years later, he also played a critically important role behind the scenes in convincing Mitsubishi Materials Corporation to apologize to and to compensate nearly 4,000 Chinese laborers who were conscripted to the firm's progenitor, which had been the Mitsubishi Mining Company during the war. And this took enormous courage on everybody's part, and Yukio deserves all the credit in the world for being dogged about making that happen. Now, Deb and I live in Lexington, Massachusetts, and it's the town where most of us here on this at this meeting will know where the first shots were fired in the American Revolution, what would become the American Revolution. And every April, Lexingtonians, like all Massachusetts residents, celebrate what we call Patriots Day. Now, I know in Canada, it's seen differently, and that's fine, but I'm going to tell you from a Lexingtonian perspective. Patriots Day begins annually with a pre-dawn, a fully costumed reenactment of Paul Revere's ride and the dramatic march of the Redcoats down Mass Ave into the town center, where they met several dozen armed farmers across a 100-meter long village green. And after an armed battle, there's a profound competition among the churches in town for having the best pancake breakfasts and so forth. And then at 11 o'clock in the morning, there's always a home game at Fenway Park for the Red Sox and the Boston Marathon. It's sort of a regional trifecta that we locals consider the most wonderful day of the year on the civic calendar. And in 2013, Yukio and Kyoko-san stayed at our home the night before the reenactment so that they could enjoy the full experience. The four of us stayed up very late into the night drinking. Drinking is a theme here that's run through all these presentations, and it's not to go unremarked upon. But we stayed up late into the night. We were drinking, we were talking. We didn't get much sleep, but we got to the village green before sunrise in time for the reenactment. And as soon as it was over, without the pancake breakfast, I hustled them back, Kyoko and Yukio, back to Boston, insisting that they take up a position near the marathon's finish line, which was just around the corner from their home on Commonwealth Avenue. And within an hour, the horrible news broke of the marathon bombing and the associated maimings and deaths. And I can't even begin to describe the relief that I felt and that Deb felt when we got Yukio on the phone and learned that he and Kyoko-san were well. They had walked back to their Boston apartment less than 10 minutes before the bombs went off. Now, by that time, and until his death, he had been a senior fellow at the MIT Center for International Studies, which I direct, and he was always so generous with his time, meeting frequently with our faculty and with our graduate students. And I was delighted that he used MIT as the base for his US operations. At the center, we reached out to, hands across the water is not quite right, but hands upstream to Harvard. We brought in Ezra Vogel and Joe Nye to join Ken Oy and Suzanne Berger and myself to form a small Benkyokai with Yukio to discuss the chapters of the memoir that Mike first learned about, because the first chapter is about his father, and in part. And he was very eager. I just want to confirm what Mike had said. He was very eager to tell his story, and he finished much of the book. And we're committed to seeing it through to publication, which I hope will happen soon. Now, I last saw him in January this year before the COVID shutdown, when we were dealing with a particularly difficult problem regarding academic freedom. And without going into the details, let me just say that I was deeply impressed by Yukio's appreciation for what academics do and why we need the space to do it effectively. The problem was solved, but sadly, not before Yukio had died of COVID-19 and before we could thank him in person for weighing in. And now this is really one very tough pivot, but Philip did ask that I join my colleagues in in setting the table for this larger discussion of Japanese foreign and security policy. So let me say a few words on that big topic, some of which Yukio might not have agreed with. Now we all know about the balance in power in Northeast Asia has shifted dramatically, and I nonetheless do think that viewing the strategic environment from Tokyo's perspective is a good place to begin a conversation at this time of leadership change, both in Tokyo and in Washington. Now, as I see it, Tokyo is facing two major fronts, China and the United States, and a third lesser, but sadly nearly as complicated one on the Korean Peninsula. And I won't have the time to do justice to each, but let me begin with what I think are the most salient facts from Tokyo's perspective, starting with China. Of course, and this should be well known to everyone, but just in case, during the past decade and a half, Japan's GDP went from roughly twice that of China's to about 1/3 the size. That's a huge shift in material terms. And while Japan's per capita GDP per capita remains far higher, sharply differential economic growth rates have impinged directly on Japanese national security. Chinese military budgets have grown in real terms by hundreds of percent, while Japan's defense budget has grown less than 20%. And Japan's defense spending, while it's growing again, this was a great contribution by, I think, Prime Minister Abe. But it's grown from a base less than 1/5 that of China's. Now, Japanese strategists have long been concerned about the impact that China's economic and military modernization has had on US capabilities in the region. 2 years before the Trump presidency, long before the Trump presidency, and a year before we were sure, when we knew that the US military had lost its exclusive control of the air and the sea near the Chinese coast, a former chief of staff of the ground self-defense forces stated very flatly that the security environment surrounding Japan had become worse than it was at any time during the Cold War. And as China got stronger, and as US wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq dragged on, some in Japan, as in other allied capitals, began to question whether the United States could, I should say would, or even could, really double down on its Cold War dominance. So here I'm echoing Tadokoro Sensei's remarks. One now retired diplomat who's a colleague of Yukio's, who's not given to hyperbole, warned as far back as 2008 of what he called the gradual evaporation of US leadership. And the point is simple, is that it's even before President Trump, and then even before he injected and then repeatedly re-injected new uncertainties into all US alliances. The implications of the shifting imbalance in the region were publicly and repeatedly acknowledged by Japan's senior defense and intelligence professionals. So today, the need for Japan's strategic ability clearly seems ever more urgent to many Japanese. So the editorialists and the politicians and the academics are asking not only how much Washington will provide to Japan, but how much Washington will require, how much more Washington may require from Japan, and more openly than ever before, what Japan will need to do for itself. And that ex-diplomat who I quoted who talked of the gradual evaporation of US leadership way back in 2018 is talking now about the staggering decline in US leadership that has precipitated a crisis of credibility in the relationship. Those are his words, they're not mine. Don't shoot the messenger. The perception may change as US leadership shifts from Trump to Biden, but Pandora's box is open, it seems to me anyway, that China has risen, North Korea is a nuclear state, and the United States has demonstrated that it can be unreliable. So there's a growing chorus. They're not screaming at the top of their lungs, but there's a growing chorus of folks striving to identify a plan B for Japan. And to be clear, most participants in the discussion hope to strengthen the alliance. The alliance is important in all of these plans B, but they're thinking about this while simultaneously hedging. Again, Tadokoro-san's remarks struck me as right to the point, against the degradation of that alliance. Some would focus on enhanced conventional defense, others focused on a deepened partnership with other regional states, and a third cluster of these Plan Bs seek cooperative arrangements that might include accommodation with China. A fourth option, of which where the discussion is much more nascent, involves rethinking the efficacy of extended deterrence itself. You're beginning to hear rumbles of that kind of conversation. So this is not entirely new. Mike will affirm that. But for the reasons that I've noted, this time, for me, it feels a little bit different. Fundamentally, the debate is based on different views of China and the United States, both. After decades of accepting, sometimes grudgingly, but mostly without too much questioning, that the US supremacy in Asia would be the foundation of its foreign and security policies, finding the right distance between the United States and China while preventing a suffocating condominium that would block and cut Japan out of regional decision-making has been the most important strategic choice facing Japan for a long time. That kind of G2 remains, it seems to me, very remote these days. But getting the distance between the two great powers right is as important as ever. And those who believe that rivalry with China is unavoidable, and those who insist that Japan must do more to prepare for the coming day, the day they think is coming, when US capabilities slip below US commitments, or when both slip below Japan's comfort level, would wish Japan to be distant from both major powers. So they would seek to acquire and sustain an independent military capability. That's a long shot. That's not happening. But if it were within reach, there'd be no reason for them to hedge bets on the rise of China or the relative decline of the United States. Japan would simply do what it has to do for itself in a self-help world. But there's, again, limited appetite for that, public appetite for that. Second, though, there are those who insist that unless Japan accommodates the Chinese power, it'll lose influence in the region and then globally. So rather than distancing Japan from both the United States and China, they would have Japan bandwagon with China. They'd have to imagine Beijing as a generally responsible stakeholder and contributor to regional stability, which is, sort of hard to imagine these days. But it's a view, and it's a view of some. The third option is exactly the opposite. Japan, again, Mike was right, individuals make these choices. To choose to discount the economic benefits that are derived from a closer relationship with Beijing, and to be more attentive to the direct military threats that China poses. And it's designed to avert abandonment by its US security guarantor at a time when Japan is still too weak to deal with a risen China and a nuclear-armed North Korea on its own. Finally, for those who fear Chinese betrayal and US abandonment in equal measure, there's a fourth strategy that would try to square the two circles. So despite the talk of going all in with the United States, this would sort of aim at Japan's having it both ways. Those who advocate this option want to believe that better economic relationships with Beijing need not be purchased at the price of diminished relations with Washington. They would fashion Japan as a middle power that could maintain the US-Japan alliance, perhaps even enhance it via membership in Five Eyes, if allowed in, and at the same time protect against Chinese economic predation via either RCEP or other liberalizing trade arrangements. So now the readouts of the meetings in Tokyo between Prime Minister Suga and Foreign Minister Wang last month suggest that this sort of dual hedge may be afoot. Japan and China have made no progress on the Senkaku dispute. They announced no plans for Xi Jinping's visit to Tokyo, but they did discuss the relaxation of trade tensions, and rumors are flying regarding China's interest in joining the CPTPP. Now, so far, nearly every Plan B, as I say, explicitly reaffirms the importance of the alliance with the United States, and that's reassuring. Even as Japan experiments with the option by forming its own pivot within Asia and by building new relationships with regional players. By leading the effort, as Mike said, to lead the liberal international rebuild and lead the liberal international order, and by readjusting its own security institutions and capabilities, which Tadokoro Sensei hoped would happen, and is disappointed it hasn't quite yet. Anyway, clearly, to me, Tokyo's pivot to Asia is not an abandonment of the alliance. It's designed to ensure the alliance remains robust enough for Tokyo to benefit from Washington's network of security partners, not least of all Australia in the region, but Canada as well, and doing it at a time when it deepens other relationships and sharpens its own military capabilities. Now I'm out of time, and so let me end by suggesting that a great many options are in play, and to remind everyone of what we've already heard, which is that no outcome should be unthinkable. Yukio strongly preferred a robust alliance, but he would be the first to acknowledge that maintaining peace and prosperity through the alliance was a constant struggle for him, or one that he and other custodians of regional stability long wrestled with. And we should all remember him for that. And as we do, I want to get out of your way and thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much. And I think we are all looking forward to the memoir. When will that come out?
Well, soon, I hope. We're working on it.
Okay. So I'm going to turn to Dan Snyder in a minute from Stanford. But first, I would like to read a message from Lou Polly, who is the former chair of the political science at U of T, but who also was very involved in the development of the Center for the Study of Global Japan. So he says he has to run to a class. So he said, many thanks for this wonderful tribute to our mutual friend. I treasure the memory of my visits with Okamoto-san in Boston, Tokyo, and Toronto. Every meeting was characterized by stimulating and thoughtful discussions. I think he was a scholar at heart. Certainly, we will remember him with warmth and gratitude at the University of Toronto. So now I'd like to ask Dan Snyder, who wanted to express his views personally.
Well, I'm also here with my wife, Elizabeth Rubenfein, and we met Yukio and Kyoko back about the time, maybe a little bit before Mike met him in the 1980s when we were reporters in Tokyo. And at that time, I was spending a lot of time writing about defense and security issues, not only for the Christian Science Monitor, but also for Defense News in those days. And I was deeply engaged in trying to understand the FSX controversy, looking at issues like crossing the 1% of GDP line, all of the issues that Mike was referring to. And I of course, spent many time talking to bureaucrats and officials of the Japanese government, of the Japanese Foreign Ministry, and usually getting no answers to any questions that I asked, although very politely getting no answers. And then I encountered Yukio, and it was like a sort of explosion in my world of covering Japan, because he not only gave answers, he gave them in a very colorful and direct way, which if you ever worked as a journalist in Japan, you know that the most challenging thing was to get a quote that you could use in a newspaper story that might actually be expressive. He was always expressive, and he was always honest, which I always appreciated, even when he was telling me things that I couldn't print. And we became very good friends, and we remained friends until now. And I can't tell you how stunned we both were by his passing. It was just like a shock went through our worlds. I can't think of Japan without Yukio and without Kyoko by his side. So I'm still not quite sure what to think about it. But I want to give you a couple of moments that just add a little bit, I think, to what Dick and Mike said. You know, I can't think of a person more passionate about the relationship between the United States and Japan than Yukio Okamoto. No one. And not that he was not critical, very critical at times of not only of the United States, but also of Japan. I mean, he was a sharp voice in many ways, but he deeply cared about it. And I think the experience, we went through the FSX controversy, which people don't remember, although Japanese are about to reproduce it, I noticed. It was a really interesting intermix between the technological and economic competition and the security relationship. And it was a very tense one. And he was a, that was a difficult thing to navigate, but I think he was at the center of trying to come up with a compromise on that. And that was always what he was looking for, trying to find a compromise. And I remember much later when I was back in Japan reporting, I was on a trip after the 9/11 incident, and I think Mike has referred to this. I met him actually in the Prime Minister's office, and he was advising Koizumi at that time. And he had absolutely burned into his brain the experience of the first Gulf War, and the whole, and what a trauma that was in many ways for US-Japan relations, and brought up all these questions about free riders and how Japanese don't contribute and so on. And he was determined, almost singularly determined, two things. One, that Japan would act, and again, I think it's very important what Mike said, act without, a response to American pressure, act on its own. But he was also determined to move very quickly, which is very hard to do in Japan. And working together with people in the foreign ministry, I think had drawn the same lesson from that. And they pushed through legislation enabling the dispatch of the ships. And remember, on that first day, the Japanese sent these destroyers to escort the American ships out of Yokosuka. And it was a very important symbolic act. And they moved this legislation through the Diet with incredible speed. And that was really his work. And he did it because he understood this was essential to the US-Japan relationship and to Japan's own taking of responsibility for global security. The other thing I want to talk about, though, is later, when I joined Stanford University, I became very involved in this project to look at the formation of wartime historical memory and deal with the issues of the legacy of the war. I encountered Yukio in that context, which was an interesting experience for me. And there are two sides to his engagement with the war, and he was really cared deeply about this issue. I think this is not a part of his sort of career legacy that people know as much about. And I think Mike mentioned his role in the Mitsubishi settlement in the court case in China. On one hand, he was not one of these people who wanted to whitewash Japan's history in the war, its responsibility, even for acts of war crimes and so on. And he was very clear about that. And I think he played a very important role in helping to persuade Abe to put out the statement on the 70th anniversary that I think was different than what many people expected. And I think maybe different than what Abe had set out to do on his own. But he also was pretty passionate about having still a sense of pride and honor in Japan's history. And we got into some fierce discussions about comfort women. And that was an issue on which, I spent hours with him on this. And and even I think the last time I saw him, he was still pounding away with me on this. And, he was a patriot, a deep Japanese patriot. I think that's the other piece of who he was that is so important. And I just don't, I really can't think of anybody who could match those two passions. I mean, both for the alliance and for his own country. Now, and I have to give one last note here, which is that when he went off to form his consultancy, which I agree, I forgot who said this, and whoever said it, it was a shocking event. Maybe it was the Consul General noted, it was a shocking event. No one leaves he was the rising star. He would have been, gone on that famous track in the Japanese foreign ministry up through to being vice minister, maybe, but he was a little too outspoken probably. But when he left, it was like, whoa, nobody does that. And in his consultancy, the Okamoto Associates, one of his very favorite clients was the National Football League. And he used to tell me with great pride that he'd attended every Super Bowl. I've been to one Super Bowl, but he'd been to plenty of them. He had an amazing range from Scotch to football of interest and passions. But as I said, I think at the core of it was his own country and our relationship, and most of all his wife and his family. I know who miss him greatly. So I just want to thank you very much for giving me the chance to sort of jump into this wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. That was very illuminating. I would like to just move a bit onto the legacy issue, and I was interested by some of the comments. So I'm just going to pose something for all of you to ponder. So if, in terms of what I think Mike mentioned as Japan as on the neoliberal order, defending it, free and open Indo-Pacific, CPTPP, the creation of the National Security Council under Abe, to what extent are all of those evidence of an Okamoto legacy? Does anybody want to jump in on that?
I'll start. I think that the institutional changes in Japan's national security structure have Yukio's fingerprints all over them. There are a few other people, Kato Ryozo, for example, who if you put bricks in the corner of Japanese institutions, there are a few other people whose names would be on the brick, but Yukio's would be one of the big ones, because the Soseikyoku, the Comprehensive Foreign Policy Bureau, was established basically as an NSC, a crisis management and policy planning long-range strategy center within the foreign ministry the year after Yukio left. And it was created by many of his proteges. And I think largely for the reasons he left, that in the Gulf War, Japan's government and the foreign ministry in particular was institutionally incapable of crisis management. And then the Soseikyoku became in many ways the model for the NSC. And Yukio's role in advising prime ministers, and particularly, as Dan was just saying, during the 9/11 period when I was in the White House, we could see it very, very clearly. Yukio was one of a small handful of people who was, even though he was only an advisor to the prime minister, was acting as if there was an NSC in Japan. Koizumi sort of ad hoc created an NSC-like structure. So those institutional changes are huge. And frankly, I would argue, point to, I agree with Dick's description of the different schools of thought, but one thing that's very different now is that Japan has, under the prime minister, with a souped up chief cabinet secretary as well, his authorities now are bigger. Japan has a national security institutional structure that means that Prime Minister of Japan has no alibi. 20 years ago, 30 years ago with Kaifu, even 20 years ago with Koizumi, the Japanese prime minister could have said, I don't know. And many bureaucrats would have shielded the prime minister from complicity in American or Australian decisions on crises. There is now an institutional structure that takes that away. The prime minister has to own these national security problems and crises. And when before Suga took over, I think it was Asahi Shimbun did a survey asking, what's the most important characteristic you want in the new prime minister? And you know what the answer was? The number one answer? Crisis management skills. So I think that is his most important legacy, frankly. And it was built by many of his proteges. And it will change Japanese foreign policy and politics for a generation, because prime ministers cannot escape that legacy. They now have to own crises and foreign policy responsibility, I would say. On the Indo-Pacific, others may weigh in. I never heard Yukio talk about regional order that much, but maybe Dick or Tadokoro Sensei or Phil did.
Tadokoro Sensei, did you have anything to comment on that?
Well, I'm afraid that I don't have much to add to what Mike had already mentioned. I, however, have to somewhat question somewhat optimistic view about Japanese crisis management. Mike mentioned, many of you may have already watched the B-class Shin Godzilla, the new version of the Godzilla movie, which is a stupid movie, but it depicts very well about the decision-making process within the Japanese government. And we may have already established the institutional setting, but those who are within the institutions are not well trained yet. They are, well, largely because we have never experienced, we haven't experienced a crisis in many, we are not as familiar with a serious crisis like the United States. And so even in the United States, newly elected president will be briefed before he came into the office. But in Japanese case, the prime minister all of a sudden become prime minister out of the funny intra-LDP power politics. And all of a sudden he is expected to be in charge of all sorts of crises. And our bureaucratic, our crisis management system are, they are capable people, but they are not as well experienced as many countries in the world. So we still do have many good reasons to worry about, and particularly when the prime minister is not psychologically ready to handle the crisis. And in Shin Godzilla, perhaps you may remember that the prime minister was asked to take a decision to order the self-defense force. And his answer was, do I have to decide now? And that is a typical, well, I would say typical, but that is completely conceivable reaction by future Japanese prime ministers. I'll stop here.
Dick, did you want to comment on the legacy question?
No, I think what we have here are two very different views, which is great, of what individual Japanese leaders are capable of doing in very deeply transformed institutional structures. I don't have direct lines to draw from Yukio to the new institutional structures. I think Mike had it right indirectly through his deshi, the people who used to report to him and in whose ears he likely was whispering. But I don't know how to draw the direct lines. But I am glad that he raised this because, and that you raised it, Diana, because look what we've got. Look what Japan now has, this National Security Council and National Security Secretariat. Tadokuro Sensei's doubts about its efficacy notwithstanding, these are new formidable institutions. The decline of the Cabinet Legislative Bureau, Naikaku Hoseikyo is sort of, that was the excuse. That's where I thought Mike was going. He said they won't have any excuses anymore. Well, right, because Prime Minister Abe fired the previous guy, and prime ministers could have done that long ago. They didn't. But in the meantime, you have a new set of structures that needs to be remarked upon. The National Security Council, Japanese leadership in reconstructing the liberal international order after so much damage has been done to it by that holiday that Mike described, that the United States has been on for a while. I mean, these were all consistent with Yukio's vision, but to the extent that you can draw a direct line, I'll just leave it with my two colleagues.
Can I just quickly say, Diana, that first of all, Tadokuro Sensei is right. Shin Godzilla is the best movie about Japanese politics in the last decade. But second, you can have the most sophisticated national security establishment in the world and fall flat on your face, as the US is right now with the pandemic. It doesn't guarantee you get a good outcome, but it does guarantee the prime minister will be expected to perform. And that to me, I think Dick would agree that, and I think Tadokuro Sensei would, that's a new thing for Japan, maybe in history.
Well, So since I'm Japanese, I'm inclined to be more pessimistic than my American colleagues. But I think the question is the glass is half full or half empty type of things. Things have obviously improved over the 30 years. But is it good enough to meet the mounting challenges Dick mentioned? And by whatever standard, the kind of challenge we are facing is serious. And the framework of our public discourses, I don't think have changed as much as one wish to hope. So let me register my cautious pessimism.
Diana, may I just add one more point on this, which is an institution that we haven't mentioned at all, which is the Ministry of Defense. The fact that there's a Ministry of Defense, the fact that that Ministry of Defense has a policy role to play, institutionalized in the National Security Council, is something, you know, that is really quite different. And I think, although Yukio was loyal to, obviously as a patriot of Japan, also loyal to the foreign ministry, I don't think he would have stood in the way of making sure that that a defense ministry would have a policy role to play during a crisis. And I think that also is potentially a game changer for Japan as it deals with crises. And one more thing, we're coming up in 3 months on the 10th anniversary of the last crisis, where where Japanese leadership didn't distinguish itself, Santen Juichi. So I think there have been a lot of changes, and that one you can draw a direct line for Yukio's role.
Thank you very much. We have a few more questions, but I'm afraid we've run out of time. So I would like to thank all of you for your participation. I think that Okamoto Yukio will continue to be remembered, and especially if we have a memoir out on that topic. So we look forward to that. There was a recent poll done by the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada on attitudes towards Asia. Japan does extremely well. And I think Japan and Canada share the unusual, but I guess maybe not so unusual actually, because many other Asian countries share it too, of being the meat in the sandwich between the US and China. So I think that's all the more reason for Japan and Canada to collaborate. So we now have a movie to watch, which is the new Godzilla. And I would like to thank everyone for your participation. I think that it's a very fitting tribute to Okamoto Yukio. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank
Diana.
you.